welcome everyone to this panel, which is part of Session 9 London Calling 2020, the IASPM UK and Ireland Conference. So if I could just make a few announcements first about muting microphones and cameras, please, while the session goes on, just to avoid any interference. And if you have any questions, it'd be great if you could pop them into the chat function and we'll try and read them in as we go. So if you could do that, that'd be much appreciated. And then we'll either read them out or ask you to come in and unmute and speak as we go. So if I could just ask the panel on the discussion of Birmingham and the international business of live music, a globalised local perspective. If the panel could introduce themselves and then maybe give a brief overview of the project, and then after that, if each panelist could then give a summary of their involvement in the project, and then we can start doing some questions, perhaps anything you want to ask or anything that the panel maybe wants to ask amongst themselves, and then we can take it from there. So if I could ask the panelists maybe to introduce themselves briefly and then give an overview of the project before we kick off. So over to you.
Great. So I'm going to just kick off from the very quick description of the project itself. There's basically 3 of us as the investigators and a bunch of wonderful students, assistants with us working on the project. While we work on Birmingham, the project full title is Birmingham Live Music Project, but also using for the needs of like the funding institutions, we focus on UK live music industry in the post-2019 era. When we initially did the application for the project, we focused on global challenges that live music industry is facing, and looking into the aspects of like how those global changes or national level changes, how they influence the local music scene, so like social, economic, and cultural effect. And we chose Birmingham as our focus case study. By a chance, we were very lucky because we just called it post-2019 era and it started spreading. So what we initially thought about it from things like development of streaming and things like that, other things kicked in on the way, including, for example, Brexit last year. So it kind of become automatically one of the topics and things, so those challenges that influence live music economy. And just to kind of briefly sum it up, instead of just working on the whole global perspective approach, we focused on Birmingham. And it literally started from the idea that like both me and Craig were placed in Birmingham, but we wanted to do it in the, well, not only because of the location, but also the unique character of Birmingham. So it's not London, which was the main point, but it is actually an example of city which is being affected quite extensively by various changes. So kind of looking on what are the challenges, what kind of solutions already exist, how can we build a network of actors within the city to kind of improve the situation. So I think that's briefly me. We had prepared 3 presentations and they were pre-recorded. So for the longer versions, you can have a look on the online panel. And I was just going to do short summaries of 3 papers, which were actually related to the project and presenting some of the initial results. So Adam, if you could take next. The microphone.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I thought I'd unmuted there. Thanks, Patricia. So my paper introduces part of the broader context of the project with a little bit of the background to it, the Birmingham Live Music Project, which is supported by the Nesta and AHRC funded Policy and Evidence Centre, collaboration between Aston University, Birmingham City University and Newcastle University, which is where I am. And I came in because of my history of researching live music in specific locations, some of which I cover in the project. And what the paper looks at is the general concept of a live music ecology, which is an attempt to get at the material as well as social conditions in which live music is produced. The kind of interdependence across different types of venues in a given locality, whether that's the back room of a pub to an arena. And the concept of an ecology also crucially from the perspective of the current project looks at the relationship as well as of venues of different types and sizes that might not all be part of the same scene, pardon me. It also includes non-musical actors and factors, so policymakers, licensing laws, noise, health and safety, and so forth, because these, of course, all have an important bearing on live music in particular and how it's made. So the paper considers the research background to that concept, which starts with the history of live music in Britain, that was produced by Simon Frith, Martin Clunan, Matt Brennan, and Emma Webster, third volume of which I believe is due out next year. And other work that pertains to that includes work on the cultural value of live music, firstly at a venue in Edinburgh, looking at different types of promotional activity within that venue, and then at different venue types across Glasgow, Leeds, and Camden in London. And alongside that, we formed the Live Music Exchange, which is a sort of web space that covers, pardon me, exchange of ideas across live music, which many people have contributed to, including Danny. And also, we began working on live music censuses that have been conducted by us and others over the past few years, including in our case, a trial study in Edinburgh and then the UK-wide live music census 2017, the report published in 2018. And what these reveal is that local live music ecologies are themselves interrelated and that their policy contexts take account of and are affected by the regional and national ones. So for instance, the UK live music census and indeed the cultural value work and the Edinburgh census notes the potential benefits for protecting venues of the agent of change principle, i.e. the notion that whoever is the agent of change in planning needs to manage that change. So if you build a hotel next to a venue and the venue is there first, and the hotel needs to develop and needs to deal with the soundproofing and the other way around. Now that pertains most obviously at local level in terms of buildings and their impacts, but it required policy action nationally, and indeed separate activity at Westminster and the devolved governments that cover the constituent nations of the UK, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. And other examples of this sort of relationship between national and regional policy contexts and locally that the paper covers are the 2010 Criminal Justice Act in Scotland, which changed the nature of public entertainment licenses regarding free events. And that was essentially to curtail large-scale unregulated raves, but as the date of it coming into force loomed, it turned out that local councils would have to implement it, and that it could impinge on things like a free acoustic set in a cafe or bookshop. So those tensions at local policy level here derived from a piece of national legislation, but had to be managed by local councils. Likewise, local councils in Scotland, Edinburgh in particular, explored the potential for a tourist tax, a transient visitor levy. But this required that the national government produce the legislation to allow them to enforce it. And of course, how it would be implemented and the various benefits or challenges vary across contexts, like a rural local authority or a capital city. And the research context pertains here too, since different reports with different remits took slightly different, although not wildly divergent stances on the tourist tax. You know, the work that I did looked at Scotland overall and noted the potential benefits of it, but was also the challenges of having to implement differently across a small town and a big city. But there was a slightly different stance taken by another project in my institution that looked specifically at the rural location of Argyll and Bute. Relatedly, obviously, COVID-19 remains a key concern, and notably in the policy realm. So the UK, for instance, has just announced the support package, but it remains a thorny issue as to how or whether this will support freelancers as well as major cultural institutions. But what I hope to have shown in that first paper is that what applies at the level of the local music ecology also pertains nationally and indeed internationally as well. Music businesses and cities exist in an interdependent relationship with one another and also with their broader regulatory contexts. Actors like licensing officers, health inspectors, and councillors shape and administer these. So, national response and local cultural provision are intertwined. And it's worth considering on that front that in the later 20th century and into the 21st, there was a broad trend towards using the terms of the market to make the case for the arts, so investment rather than subsidy. And that this at least partly derived from local authorities like the Greater London Council in the 80s, who deployed culture as a means of local regeneration to drive employment. So while what follows, what's in the paper itself on YouTube, is an account of a citywide research project, I hope to have shown here that the policy context for this is much broader, and that making the case at national level inevitably involves considering local concerns. And I now hand over to my colleagues to sum up their own papers. Thanks.
I think that's me next. Thank you, Adam. So to sum up, or to give a quick overview of my paper, and following on from Adam around the importance of the local, my paper focuses on a specific output of the project that we're involved in, which was the creation of an online map of music venues in the city of Birmingham. And one of the aims of that map relates to what Adam was just saying, in that one of the big unknowns in terms of the live music ecology of the city of Birmingham is how it's constituted. So what are the venues? Who are the people involved with that ecology? So in my paper, what I talk about is how we used some methods related to data to begin the process of mapping out that that ecology. So the paper that I presented tries to do three things. It tries to sort of situate that methodology and rationale within the wider understanding of popular music studies, and introducing the use of some data-derived methods and why I believe they're useful. Then I talk about the development of the map, and then I talk about what that might mean. So first of all, it's probably useful, for those of you who haven't seen it, to briefly describe the map. It's an online interface that shows 198 music venues with a B prefix postcode. So rather than looking at the wider West Midlands, we narrowed it down to just venues with a B prefix postcode. It's a map. I'm sure you've all seen maps, things like Google Maps before. When you click on a dot on the map, it shows you detail about that venue. And there's also a database view. But what we also wanted to do with that map was deploy it as a kind of crowdsourcing, data gathering mechanism, so that we could capture some of the information that perhaps wasn't available through other mechanisms, which I talk about in the paper. The kind of broader context for that, as far as my research goes, is that what I'm interested in broadly are the role of what I describe, what Hartman and colleagues describe as DDBMs, data-derived business models in popular music. And in my presentation, I talk briefly, first of all, how the implications of those sort of things perhaps don't need to be explained to an audience such as IASPM, but that briefly we can understand those as things like Spotify and social media. And the approach that I've taken in my research is to take a practice-led approach and to look under the hood to an extent and try and work out how these technologies tick. as a way of understanding what their consequences are. And now along the way, what that has meant is that I've developed some skills around what could broadly be understood as data science, which don't necessarily feature perhaps in our arsenal of methods within popular music studies. But I think they provide a way of asking some of the questions that we're all concerned with in slightly different ways. And so what we did with the map is we deployed some of those methods. We pulled in some data from the Songkick API, which is a concert recommendation service. We explored some of the issues with that data in that it's essentially corporate data, and it only presents a picture of the live music venues in Birmingham that are plugged into certain industry mechanisms like ticketing. There's also some issues that we discuss in the paper about ownership and use of that data, which are interesting. That then led us to some manual research with a student research team that pulled in some data that wasn't available or through Songkick, which opens up questions of the value of that data and whether it's available. And that enabled us to create this online map. And again, without going into too much detail of the nuts and bolts of the map, in my paper I talk about that, and I point to some resources that not only that we've used in the project, but I think perhaps importantly, those that we've developed and shared. And I think that leads to the sort of final point of my paper, which is that we've developed these resources with Birmingham in mind, and with the problem right back to the start of not understanding, there not being a picture of the ecology of the live music of Birmingham, and maybe some of these resources can help us discover that. But part of the rationale of using some of these data-derived methods, which I've kind of wedded myself to in my research, is a commitment to what Sandvig and Hargitay call the sharing of messy detail. And really that kind of boils down to the fact that if you can share the process of creating a map like this, you open up, hopefully, the possibility for the map to extend to other cities, for the people that use it in other cities to improve upon what we did, and for us to be able to improve upon our Birmingham base map by that. And hopefully we can extend the work that we've done in Birmingham to other cities and begin to ask some of the pertinent questions that are around right now, around the very survival of music venues, but also how they then deal with issues like Brexit, which are coming further down the line. And then beyond that, to whatever other questions come up later on. So that's the overview of my paper. I hope you found it interesting. And I will now pass over to Pat.
Yeah, coming online. I hope we can actually see me and that everything is working. So just double checking. Good. So in that sense, we figured out this will be the last paper because it's more related to some of the initial results. So the final paper in the panel looks at the project a bit more from non-quantitative perspective in that sense. So we had Adam with theoretical background, kind of leading principle, and how we kind of landed in the project, and particularly look at the ecology approach. We had Craig with one of our methodologies applied, so the interactive map, which is it's available online. So if you have a moment, go and have a look again at it after the session. And the last paper kind of focused on kind of more qualitative approach. So joining the project, I come in not within the popular music studies background, but I'm a political scientist, and majority of my work till date was actually on interactions of various stakeholders, interest groups, and the policymaking processes, and how those can be actually created through knowledge exchange and co-production of different resources. So kind of looking at it from the perspective of co-production of knowledge and like why and who should be included in the processes like that, we figured out we will actually implement it in our project. So it's not only looking on large data sets and information we actually have in the project, but also how can we share that information and also make sure that the information that we share that is relevant, that it's informed, but also it's something that is actually needed by various stakeholders involved in the process. So kind of the principle behind the our project is the co-production of knowledge, linking on both sides the political science perspective and understanding any type of policy regulation as a kind of system of interest mediation, but also as a knowledge-driven cluster economy from the popular music studies. So the paper basically starts from that principle and then kind of looks into the aspect of more qualitative aspects. So how do we actually build and sustain the stakeholders network? So who is included, how we kind of maintain it, how we drive it through the process. And obviously it varies per different type of network. So in our case, we specifically focused on live music ecology within Birmingham. We started very small group, and in the paper I discussed different stages through which we went actually building up a list of followers and expanding from the initial group of like 12 stakeholders that we talked to currently having 96 of them that getting updates on the project, get feedback from us, all the way to around 250 people following us on various social media. And again, paper kind of looks into the aspect of how actually different elements and stages of the project, how they started growing up the network and how the project got recognized in that sense as something which can be useful. While building network of our stakeholders and following the approach which Adam described at the beginning, we were very inclusive in building the network, and currently it's quite extensive group of people and various stakeholders, which has actually very broad definition. So while we're working on live music economy an ecological approach to it within the city, it doesn't mean it's only musicians, promoters, and venue owners. There's also quite a big representation in the project of industry associations, but also local and regional government representatives, including police forces, but also research and education institutions. So the, not only from the perspective of researchers, but also kind of expanding on the institutions which are actually training people who later on will be part of the network. We also have consulting companies, legal support, things like that. So the definition of our stakeholders network is actually very broad. Now, keeping that particular network and different stakeholders involved is one of the important elements of the project, because it provides us with extremely useful feedback loop. And we do it not only through social media, but also direct interactions, keeping our keeping stakeholders informed on the progress in various publications. We also have smaller consultation groups for various stages of the project. So, for example, the very first draft of the map was sent in first to the smaller group to test it up, what other variables we can add. The sample applies, for example, into the surveys, which we are currently testing and getting feedback. Now, what is the positive result kind of coming up to it? So it's not only the data collection, but also the thing that how those particular exchanges can help us build up a bit better, more relevant set of information and answer more questions that we initially would do. So in the paper, I described in the detail one of the workshops that we hold with our stakeholders at the very early stages of the project, when we simply looked at effects of Brexit on live music industry in Birmingham. So instead of just going and talking about various limitations, extensions, and so on, we literally asked people who work within our industry about the effects, the expectations, what they're worried about, and so on. We got very positive response in the sense that next to the problems indicated by other actors at the national level, we actually got a chance to discuss what would be a really regional effect of that process. So looking at that into more detail in the presentation. So just here, it's kind of mentioning two most which we were kind of interested and came up from the stakeholders group was future of high-end production companies in the region, which is definitely not the problem for the whole country, but is very specific and risky for the area of Birmingham, as well as, for example, element of culture pushback. So that was done during the stakeholders meeting in the workshop. Next to that, we the email correspondence with our project partners and stakeholders is also kind of very important element. And that one is especially now very useful when it comes to the challenges related with COVID, because normally we would have larger issues related with access to a lot of information. However, because of sustaining the network, we actually are able to simply send the request for feedback on various documents and random specific questions that we have, and we get a very quick response. So we are not too much blocked and slowed down by COVID, so we can still maintain the research just because we kind of maintain the network and become quite active part of it in that sense. So just to kind of sum up the last point, so Y project has very strong theoretical setup. We started implementing it in practical ways, including, for example, the interactive map. But also important element of it is actually interaction with various stakeholders and looking into searching for information which is actually relevant for people who are part of the live music ecology in Birmingham. Okay, so that would be it from me then.
Thank you, thank you, Pat. I think it's an excellent overview. There's one question to come in, so maybe I'll start with that, if that's okay, from Rinku. It's okay if I read this out. So to Craig, I think maybe specifically, in which ways will the pandemic have an effect on the dynamics of your mapping? So, or bearing, sorry, have a bearing on the dynamics of your mapping?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It is a good one, and I can point to a specific example of how it was a problem. Because we were using data scraping in the first instance that was pulling in live concert information. We were lucky in the sense that when we did that, it was kind of mid-March, early March, and that data was based on upcoming events for the next 3 months. And that was how we got a lot of venue information data. Had we have not run that process before then, if we'd have tried to have run it in June, for example, of course there would have been no upcoming music events, and we would not have been able to have got venue information. So there's that. In terms of the mapping, I think one of the things that we discussed as a project is that having got that information in March, rather than thinking of that information as live information, we perhaps thought about that as almost as a pre-COVID baseline of what the landscape looked like before this. So in terms of the dynamics of the mapping, what we're now running into is when we're trying to get to additional information that wasn't available online or wasn't easy to get, and by which I mean information that you perhaps have to get directly from people through an email or a phone call or a conversation. We or our research team found that 60% of venues were just not responding to even digital requests, so that they almost kind of didn't exist. Not only did they kind of fail to exist as fail is the wrong word, were prevented from existing physically, they were also not manifesting in any kind of digital format. So it certainly does have a bearing. How we cope with that is a problem for the project to work with through the next few months. But hopefully, Rinku, answers your question.
Yeah. Thank you, Craig. And if you had a follow up to that at all, or anyone else wants to follow up on that. So if I could just sort of throw some in. So Adam, I kind of I sort of first met you at a sort of very early live music exchange event back in 2011, maybe. Yeah, in Edinburgh.
2013.
Yeah. So, and I'm conscious at the time, and I was at that point, I was sort of, I was in industry still, and I was coming up as kind of like one foot in industry, one foot in academia. And I'm just thinking about this notion of knowledge exchange, which Pat also mentioned. I just think how valuable you found that process to be. So I think, particularly around the agent of change, I was struck how it seems to me academics had actually created, a real change in industry. And I thought maybe then in some ways that was quite a first, maybe even coming from that kind of background. I wonder if you could sort of discuss a bit more on how that kind of knowledge exchange, you've seen that process working maybe in this project.
Good question. I think how it's worked in this project is partly a result of sort of changes over the way that we have formulated, as Live Music Exchange, we formulated projects so that the UK Live Music Census, part of the reason that our input on Agent of Change had any bearing, well, not had any bearing, had as much bearing as it did, was because built into that project was, some cooperation with industry partners. Now, there are always tensions there to manage, because, quite naturally, we're coming at the same subject from different sort of methodological approaches. As you'll know yourself, when you're running a festival or a venue, you've got a different set of concerns to when you're working for a university. But the sort of successful aspect of coming at it from those different approaches is that it allows industry to sort of have data that they can say, look, this isn't just something that we've cobbled together to make our point. This data is being produced independently. So that there's a sort of robustness there. And then from the academic perspective, it's like, well, we haven't just sort of drawn these questions out of thin air to address our kind of, to address some sort of random ivory tower concept. We have formulated them in conversation with the people that the answers directly affect, so that you get a more kind of efficacious approach to the policy sphere. And so that kind of partnership that we sort of saw, built into the cultural value work, and then even more so into the Live Music Census. As you say, it's been a number of years. And by the time we came to this project, that was almost like a sine qua non. If you want to do this kind of work and you want it to have an effect in the policy sphere, you can't discount those conversations. You have to have them. So that sort of baseline to our research, but actually even more broadly the research culture that had evolved over those years was in place when we were putting together the Birmingham work, if that makes sense.
Pat, did you want to talk a bit more about the kind of you'd say about the feedback loop with the stakeholders, which I think was really, really interesting points about the speed of which that kind of exchange is taking place?
Yeah. It is actually a lot dependent on keeping in touch with various stakeholders and so on. And it's really important to kind of realize where we're coming in with the project to work with various people. So it's not that, well, we are researchers, so we come in from the background when that's our main work, and you have to I realized that the people you're working with, they have tons of other things to do on their list. So you have to make it worth for them to get engaged. So actually giving them impression they're an important part of the project and that we're actually implementing their feedback actually creates this trust. So whenever, for example, we need additional information, they know that then it's going to be actually used for something. It's not that we're asking randomly and so on, which is very useful, because then, for example, the amount of questions we ask in surveys or during the workshops, it's not unlimited and we will collect a lot of information. It's actually focusing on the topics which are of their main interest. So in that sense, the feedback loop, it is a lot of additional work, but it's definitely worth it. And kind of recognition of that and maintaining the exchanges between the stakeholders is actually quite important element. So in that sense, the feedback loop allows us not only for corrections and different interpretations, but actually engaging with also various types of stakeholders. So kind of expanding their understanding of the ecology.
I think I totally understand that. So a question from Kai, I think perhaps it's all three of you, maybe one at a time, but however you want to approach this. So can you elaborate a little bit on your preliminary thoughts about the potential ramifications of Brexit for UK music ecologies, and perhaps particularly with regard to the idea of the cultural pushback? So who wants to kick off on that one?
Well, I can start with that.
Thank you, Pat.
Would be easier. Okay, so during the stakeholders meetings and workshops that we talked with, one of the things which various actors, I don't want to use the very broad term and so on. So people at the table that we talked to mentioned that one of the things they really worry and comes in, for example, in booking the gigs or sending bands abroad, is the aspect that Brexit has is perceived quite negatively outside of UK. So it doesn't matter, at this time we're not focusing on the interpretation of benefits, cost benefits calculations from the UK side, but from the outside world is actually viewed as something quite negative. And taking that a lot of touring is actually happening between the UK and Europe, Brexit is kind of viewed as okay, so what happened? So it has a very, very negative implications in the terms of perception of the country, its openness towards actually welcoming tours from Europe. And because of that, a lot of our stakeholders basically said that it's a quite big problem looking from the perspective of you trying to book a band coming from Europe to UK on a tour. When they actually kind of go, why would we come to UK? You went for Brexit, we don't want to really go and visit. But that kind of creates the image when also, for example, bands from America kind of look at it, okay, so will it be more administration now for us to come in? So it's kind of one aspect of the cultural pushback. The other aspect is, which kind of long-term creates additional problem, is the homogenization of the music scene. Because bands do not come, or the British bands don't travel outside, you kind of get stuck a bit, and there's lesser chance for exchanges and kind of creative approach to creating music.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. That lack of interaction in music scenes. So, yeah, I like that much. Adam, would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of add to that in terms of the practical aspects of it are obviously myriad. And for British bands wanting to tour abroad, and also other bands wanting to come to Britain, so even sort of things that would still allow for touring become significantly more challenging. So if, for instance, I forget the nomenclature, if for instance it becomes around a tier 5 visa, which if we apply it, then it's likely that the EU would reciprocate. Now that adds a little bit of extra admin and cost for an act wanting to come to the UK. But if you're a band wanting to tour Europe and you think that you might have to apply for that and pay for it, even if it's not, on a one-off basis, a massive expense, if you wanted to tour in a continent and you had to do that for each country, then that adds up. And add in the fact that if you're a sort of smaller scale or even a mid-level band, then those, you know, those costs and the time that it takes to process the administration could basically rule out these kind of low-level tours that a lot of acts use to launch themselves effectively in that market. And then there's all the sort of extra musical aspects that are really important, that it's difficult to manage, particularly, you know, if you're Paul McCartney or whoever, it's one thing, but if you're, you know, an indie band in a van, it's another. You know, are you going to need a carnet for boxes of CDs? What about your T-shirts? You know, getting there. I mean, there have already been anecdotal examples of acts getting sort of stopped at borders and delayed and so forth. So those sorts of things could really, you know, bring the hammer down on touring. And then in terms of local live music ecology, one of the things that came up in Birmingham is that, you know, venues and gigs don't exist in a vacuum. So the West Midlands, for instance, has got production companies. What happens to the work for those people? You know, do touring, you know, if a major act is touring Europe and they're thinking, oh, well, we need, you know, stage crew and lighting crew and technical crew, and there's this great, you know, company in the UK that supplies them, but then if we're going to have to apply for visas for all of those, well, why don't we just use technical crew from Ireland or France or whatever? So there are knock-on effects as well.
No, absolutely. I mean, I spoke to a tour manager a while ago that said that acts coming from America now go into Europe rather than the UK and start there rather than start from the UK. So I think that's exactly what you're saying. Craig, did you want to come in on this subject?
The only thing I'd add to what's been said is that I think at a very local level, in terms of the cultural pushback, I think promoters and venue owners are proud of what they do, and that promotes Birmingham to the wider UK and beyond. So if they're not, you know, if their options are limited in terms of what they can offer, then that's a concern for them. I think that's another sort of root of the cultural pushback as well. You know, there's how does Birmingham compete against? I mean, Manchester and London and everywhere would be in the same boat, but there's certainly a local identity of what occurs within the ecology that is driving this concern around cultural pushback as well.
A question I wanted to ask myself, really, this, you know, when I was playing in bands and touring the UK, every town had its own scene and its own identity, and something I was just wondering if there's any sense of any kind of positiveness that they're becoming slightly more homogenous and there's slightly more, you know, Birmingham scene or anything. Is there's any sense of that in conversations you've had with stakeholders? Hang on. So
it just kind of all kind of distinguishes between short and long-term effects, because you know, the immediate effect if the kind of worst case scenario appears with Brexit and limits to like the exchanges and touring and so on, it opens possibilities for the local bands, because there will be slots open for them to kind of like fill in the rooms and so on. But it's kind of very short-term perspective, because how long they can do it, how many times one particular band can actually play in the local scene without kind of being a bit boring and not actually changing the outlook of the scene. And the same kind of applies. So that's kind of problem really, like, yeah, it has a tiny positive effect, but then it's not going to last for long. It has a limited time.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah. Okay, question here from Rinku. Would it be accurate to state that the current situation has added new challenges to comm strategies, or can it be read as an opportunity too?
I think Well, the current situation, meaning COVID rather than Brexit, I guess.
Mm.
But what we've seen is that obviously people's economic possibilities have been reduced because they can't sell tickets and all of that sort of stuff.
Mm.
And really, the majority of the activity we've seen online, which is where everything's had to go, has been to do with kind of community and branding, and there aren't really any business models that someone can hang their hat on yet. You know, there isn't really an off-the-shelf live music streaming business model that you could kind of say, okay, this can kind of fill some of the gap. So I think the interesting things around comms is that what's happening is venues, by which I mean, and promoters are trying to keep their clientele and their kind of base of partners, whether that be musicians or promoters, involved in a conversation around the venue and the survival of the venue, and a kind of a message of hang in there and we'll all come out of this the other side together. But mostly that is based on kind of existing social media channels like Facebook and so on and so forth. So I'm not convinced that represents a shift in how that sort of thing would be understood, you know, like the delivery of key messages and timing of messages. But what it may lead to, which is potentially interesting, is, well, is somebody smarter than me going to come up with, you know, or the rest of us, somebody, you know, some 15-year-old kid in his bedroom is going to come up with the Napster of live music streaming, and in 5 years' time we're all going to go, oh well, did we need music venues? I'm sure that won't be the case, but that's a possibility, you know. I think we shouldn't necessarily discount. But yeah, certainly in terms of comms, it really is kind of maintaining brands, maintaining communication, and a kind of a holding pattern and a wait and see is what I've observed.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. This notion, the 15-year-olds or whatever on the kind of the new Napsters, we're seeing some of these raves happening in kind of you know, Manchester and everything else. The kind of recent moving underground raves. I know a lot of legislation that came in, you said, was the Criminal Justice Act, to kind of dampen these things down a number of years ago, and you know, now they're sort of like springing up. I'm just wondering if there's anything that you've observed maybe in Birmingham, that there's maybe a kind of an outsider kind of group forming, or if some of the stakeholders you're already engaging with are sort of exploring non-traditional ways of putting on live music or live events.
Sorry, I would just say that is one of the, to sort of hark back to a point that came up earlier, but also a broader point. You know, it's been said previously, I think Simon Frith noted it in his address to a European music forum. People are going to make music whatever. You know, whatever conditions are imposed, people will find a way to make music, and the sort of the policy priority should be a way, rather than sort of to kind of support that and allow it to happen and allow it to sustain. Alongside that, one of, you know, and bearing that in mind, one of the current challenges from a sort of public health perspective, I guess, is that is going to happen. And inevitably, if you run an established music venue, part of your concern as both a citizen and a business is, how are you going to do that safely? How are you going to do that and maintain the 2 meters or 1 meter or whatever it is this week? And the difficulty, and again, hopefully someone smarter than me can resolve this, but I don't think it's going to happen soon or imminently, and at least, is how to allow that, you know, new outsider activity, as you put it, to sort of flourish and happen, without, you know, if you're going to put a rave on in a field, you aren't bothered about how many hand sanitizers. I mean, you might be, but you're not as constrained by how many hand sanitizers per square meter and, you know, markers for 2 meters and all the rest of it, in the same way that someone that's got a bricks and mortar infrastructure and council tax to pay will necessarily be. And it's sort of allowing the one to emerge, you know, musically, whilst not you know, you need to manage that, but then also support the established infrastructural organizations at the same time. I realize that that's a massive question in response to your question, but it strikes me that that should be a kind of fairly urgent policy concern.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I think it also, just to come in on that, I think also it speaks to the problems of the mapping activity that we had, you know, and understanding the ecology of live music. In the, you know, those venues that are visible are those that are plugged into the industry mechanisms. There are others at a level or a strata sort of slightly below that you can find if you Google them. But one of the reasons we went for the crowdsourcing element as well in this project is that there are going to be things happening in Birmingham that Facebook and Google don't know about. You know, it could be a folk club in a place of worship. It could be an open mic night in an Italian restaurant or whatever, and those things perhaps wouldn't flag up. And of course that would apply also to an illegal rave, or however, whatever the kids are calling those things. They were called illegal raves back in my day. I don't know whether they have a cooler name these days, maybe. But do you know what I mean? These things won't flag up through some of the mechanisms they're using, and that's part of the challenge of making the claim that you're demonstrating the ecology of a live music in a given city, because there will always be things, hopefully, you know, because that's the lifeblood of popular music, that there are things that old people don't know about, you know. But yeah, if that is happening in Birmingham right now, yeah, we don't know about it, but also for right and wrong reasons, it's hard to spot.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, kind of coming on that one, like something which we observed across Birmingham during the time as a kind of alternative to the traditional live gigs. So there are some of the regular things which happens also in other cities. So live streaming, organizing of crowdsourcing and things like that. But there are some of the solutions being introduced which are starting kind of implementing or going towards stage 3. So the roadmap to recovery stage 3 with the outdoor events. The tricky part is that a lot of information which we gather allows us to, for example, estimate that, yes, stage 3 outdoor events, but actually it's a very small portion of venues and traditional understanding venues which can actually organize anything. So in that sense, one of the results of our research is actually the fact, well, lovely, we're at stage 3, even at stage 5, city will be on around 25% capacity of what they normally could do. So that's one thing. The other thing which comes from the stakeholders as a kind of, not necessarily the rave approach, but as an alternative to the regular summer festival season, one of the initiatives kind of coming up from the mostly jazz and folk and which is usually basically 2 festivals in the city in the summer. Next to the online kind of organized streaming and so on, they also organized summer long time small capacity festival. So instead of having one larger event across 3 days, it's actually happening through the summer with the smaller groups of people and kind of shifting the artists performing, implementing social distancing and doing it in very small groups in outdoor spaces. So just as a kind of alternative to current restrictions.
Yeah, yeah, I'm struck with the mostly jazz and events. Just something that from when I read the UK Live Music Census, and again maybe this is based on the same topic. There was it seems to be quite a tension that was developing at the time between the bricks and mortars and the kind of the outdoor events promoters, and the sense that the way I read it, that festivals are being always held up as being these fantastic events, and it's great to have them, but that they actually draw a lot of the the footfall away from the more traditional venues. And I just wonder if you're saying now about the kind of the roadmap that kind of leads us is going to go straight towards live events again. I just wonder if that's something you think will increase the tension or with some of the stakeholders.
I don't know is the simple answer. The more complicated answer, I guess, is, I think part of what emerged from the census is not so much sort of festivals versus venues as sort of a concern from some stakeholders of a sort of within the festival sphere of a proliferation of events getting marketed as festivals, and that sort of seeming to that can sort of undermine that it's the wrong word, but that kind of brand of event. You get some very established, well-run places saying, well, we've been doing this for 10 years and we've used the Purple Guide and all the rest of it, but as the market gets more and more saturated, if you have people sort of coming up and saying, oh well, yeah, here's our local festival, and it's kind of a glorified fete in a park, and that runs for 2 years and doesn't succeed, or it falls flat on its back and a couple of people don't get paid, that it undermines the broader market. I don't know how that's going to pan out in the light of restrictions that are currently in place, and that we will hope would be it would be possible to relax them before too long. But if we get a second wave, it could come back. So it's kind of more tension between how do you deal with a very crowded market, and sort of, it's an inevitable part of any or any live music ecology, but any kind of business ecology, that as it becomes more crowded, and as I'm sure sort of people in IASPM will know, the last 20 years have seen live music become it just has become a bigger market, and as that growth happens, then inevitably there's going to be tension between established players, new entrants, and then within those categories, those that are sort of larger, are they supported by, is it some new festival that's supported by AEG or Live Nation or whoever, or is it produced at local level?
Yeah, I don't know again how much the stakeholders you're dealing with have sort of engaged with the topic, but we're seeing a lot of maybe drip drip-fed information to the media about a rebalancing of the live music ecology, where Live Nation as promoters decided now that maybe the risk should be shared more with agents in particular, and maybe other stakeholders. And I just wonder if that's something you think is you can see it starting to play out in the project. I know maybe it's very, very early days, but I know I was always struck by Simon Frith saying how promoting is ridiculous business. Is you take all that risk and for virtually with no safety net, and that maybe this is an opportunity for a rebalancing of that ecology in a way that perhaps will sustain some of the stakeholders in ways that perhaps they've, as you say, you set something up as an event, you run it for 2 years, it's gone. It maybe will provide opportunities for a bit of a rebalancing that might be healthy in the longer term.
Sorry, Pat. From the perspective of this particular project, my sense is that it's a bit early to say, because people are currently just trying to keep the wheels rolling.
Yeah. People are treading water. I don't think people are. I don't get the sense that independent promoters kind of thinking now's the time to collectivize and take down Live Nation. I think they're more thinking of can we pay the office bill next month? That's the sense I get. And of course the other problem, I guess, is the longer this goes on, who is more likely to be able to ride it out, and it's not the independent promoters, I guess. But no, there's no sense that, COVID all over is a gender petri dish, isn't it? It's a chance to push certain things that, if you're the climate change lobby or the universal basic income lobby, this is the best time you'll probably ever have to make your case, But I don't get the sense that independent music promoters in Birmingham, are grasping the nettle at this particular time. Yeah, they just want to keep the lights on.
Yeah.
Maybe kind of bit concluding point. Coming back to Danny's original question, like the venues versus festivals and so on. What we observed in Birmingham is actually not really venues against festivals. Actually, that cooperation works quite well. I wouldn't say perfectly, but actually festivals organized within city limits, they actually promote the cultural aspect of the city, so they present it as a more interesting to visit. So in that sense, a lot of venues actually benefited from festivals being organized within the city. So the Moseley Folk mentioned before, which basically sustains quite a network of venues around the event. Also other types of events coming around. In that perspective, kind of coming also to what Adam and Craig said, it's not really the festivals versus venues, it's rather the independent sector versus the one more established. So you have Live Nation, exactly. Which probably will have some losses, but will maintain their presence because they can afford it. So when you go down all the way back to independent promoters, smaller venues, currently with implementation of stage 5 of proposed roadmap, a lot of them will not be able to open for live music, implementing all the restrictions and so on, and still do the profit.
Is there any sense yet of the policy requirements that you think might be coming with public health? Is that kind of being mapped out for independent promoters? Do you know if there's any sort of movement on that?
Beyond the your existing space now that did hold 150 people or 450 people now has to have people at whether it's 2 or 1 meter distance, but essentially here's how your capacity is going to be slashed is what we've got so far. More policy coming down the line, but certainly in terms of what promoters know or are aware of, they don't know much, you know, and I think that's part of the frustration.
And the continuously implemented changes and shifts in regulations. I know they're hard to predict, but some of the things, like when we were starting just a few weeks ago, doing like the checkup of the roadmap and how it's going to actually affect various cities and venues in the city, a relatively short analysis, and we had to adjust it already 2 or 3 times just based on different changes coming up, which is a bit self-promotion. So check out our webpage. There will be a blog coming up about it in a few days. It's almost ready. It's just we're adjusting the 3rd version.
Almost hustling. Good.
Okay. Just at this point, if there's anyone wants to kind of want to come in, I mean, I think maybe you know, you can unmute, come on camera, and ask the questions directly. That might be good. If anybody feels they've got a question they want to ask direct rather than sort of through the chat, if I can throw that one out there to anybody wants to jump in. He says. Okay, no takers. No, fair enough. So I was just question, Craig, go back to just the top just for a moment. And you mentioned about digital data collection and live music. And I just wondering if it's sort of something that is a sign that the live music research in general has kind of developed over time with bringing in those elements.
You mean in terms of using those sort of large scale data?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I think, as with a lot of these things, you're reliant on, and you have to kind of manage the claims that you make and the work that you're doing with the fact that you're working with essentially corporate data. You know, so Songkick being the example that we used in this project, but you could apply this, I think, across the board. If you're looking at music listening, how much you want to kind of how do I put this? How much you want to kind of put your hand up and say, I defend this data as being truthful and useful, when actually you're only allowed, even as a researcher with resources to do the research, the time and the skills, for example, to do the research, you're only allowed access to the data that Songkick or Spotify or Twitter or whoever want to give you the access to. So I think you need to temper. For me, the more interesting questions lie in why can't I have that piece of data, or, you know, wouldn't it be useful if we had this? So in terms of live music, for example, you know, I know there's a really interesting question around DJ sets at festivals, and DJs don't report the records they play at festivals, and so therefore the rights holders don't get the money, you know, and yada yada yada. So unpicking that particular kind of problem kind of says, well, okay, well, where do we get that data? Who owns that data? What could we do with it? You know, so it almost becomes you could probably have a project just on the problems with accessing the data that you would need to answer the question that you really want to answer, if that makes sense. I don't know whether that answers your question, but yeah, it's like Lisa Gittelman said, there's raw data is an oxymoron. Basically, it's politicized to a granular level.
Yeah, I would just add that one of the to Craig's point, that kind of points to the value of sort of triangulating, and, you know, what we try to do in the Cultural Value Project, in the UK Live Music Census, and here is, you know, realize the you know, there's always going to be limitations. So Songkick data, you're limited to what they put out. If you do a survey and it's a big public survey, then, you know, there's who's responding to it. So you need to sort of triangulate with all these other sources, you know, and organizations that survey their own members, because they might get a different, you know, like a more complete set of responses from that particular group. But then they're limited to that particular group. But then if you do a sort of a big public one, you're limited to who responds to it. So, you know, you take those methods, you triangulate them against the sort of the big digital one and qualitative research as well. And from a sort of policy perspective, you know, as we put in the census, I don't think we put it in the census report, but as we've you know, noted in publications since then, policymakers like a big number. You know, they like that quant stuff. You know, the value of music in the UK is X billion, the percentage of self-employed is Y%. But actually over the last sort of 15, 20 years, they have become more responsive to qualitative information as well, and narratives. And I think the option of having one or the other is less. There is less of an option to have one or the other, and you do kind of need to contextualize your you know, your big data against qualitative information that the kind of people Craig talked about will be able to provide.
I completely agree with that point. Yeah, it's you need all of this stuff. Why not use all of this stuff if it's available to you? You know.
Yeah, for sure. Just question, you know, something that struck me all the time. Maybe the music industry's got very good. Live music is saying, you know, celebrating UK music, the amount it generates to the economy, and how successful in these large festivals generate all this kind of incomes and all the ancillary items that get included and all that. And I'm just wondering if, you know, if you're talking to stakeholders on the ground, you know, how much that reflects their reality in the kind of, you know, the economic environment they work in. I appreciate right now that may be completely off the scale, but, you know, when you were sort of collecting data originally, just wondering how much it felt that the live music ecology in Birmingham was thriving.
Okay, so maybe then I'll comment. So there are obviously some trend. Well, let's start from, we're talking pre-COVID.
Sure.
That's as a kind of starting point. So there are some trends which are very characteristic across the whole country. So, like, you know, touring season is pretty much the same period of time as it is for the rest of the country, for Birmingham and so on. The largest differences in that perspective is that a lot of actually local talent and so on, it's so close to London that there's a big drive of that kind of going away. So in that sense, Birmingham started becoming kind of this, you know, a cubicle, the beginning of the road, rather than farther stages. So it's a ground to develop the talent, but the talent, when it starts getting a bit better, it gets snicked out very quickly to London. So in that kind of, it's a blessing and a curse that Birmingham is so close to London. So that was the kind of difference, and it has an effect on the venues and local music scene, because the local venues serve as this kind of area when the talent develops. And what we're trying to kind of, and what's coming up also from different actors within the city, is kind of looking at it from the perspective, well, we can't stop them from going to London, but maybe we can bring them back later on when they're touring across UK. So in that sense, it's kind of interesting city and output, which comes from the fact that it is a city which is different from like Manchester or Liverpool, having like elaborate music history with Beatles and so on. Birmingham is close to London, and that's its kind of cost benefit situation.
I totally understand that argument. I'm sorry, I'm conscious that the time has moved on. If there's any more questions anyone would like to ask, then please feel free to do so now. well, if not, then maybe take the opportunity to thank the panel, to Pat and Craig and to Adam for a really enjoyable panel discussion. I think there was so many elements that we could have kept going all night once we start to put it around. And I must say, from a personal point of view, I love live music research. I think it's so rich, and I'm really glad that we're now developing so many new ways of looking at live music that perhaps weren't there before. And say someone who's coming from industry, and it's great to see that the knowledge exchange as it's developed, and how useful that is for all those involved. So if I could just finish up by thanking everyone and reminding everyone that Alex DeLacy's weekly discussion group meets on Friday at 4 p.m. UK time as normal, and Alex will send the invite out by Eventbrite. And next week we have the final session on the technology of popular music with a keynote by Samantha Bennett of ANU on Tuesday morning, and a couple of other events will be announced by email, social media, and the website. So if I could just again thank you all for your time and for sharing that with us, and I look forward to keeping up to date with the blog, etc., as you go through, and everything else that comes through. So thanks so much, and thank you.